Molly Hardy, and I'm the Director for Digital and Book History Initiatives here at the American Antiquarian Society. Before we begin, let me please offer a quick reminder to please silence your phone. And let me also now welcome you to Antiquarian Hall. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, let me briefly tell you that AAS is a national research library and learned society of pre-20th century American history and culture. Our collections include approximately 4 million items. While we have extensive manuscripts, the vast majority of the Society's collections are printed materials, newspapers, pamphlets, books, graphic art materials, and all manner of ephemera. Most of the programs and services of the AAS including our website, access to our library and its resources, and our public programs like this talk are available to you free of charge. We consider this part of our mission. But we are also a private nonprofit organization that relies on the generosity of our donors for our existence. Please consider making a contribution to the Society, either by sending us a check, contributing online, or dropping some cash in the donation box on your way out of the hall. Your support in every way is very, very important to us, so we thank you. The James Russell Wiggins Lecture in the History of the Book and American Culture is an annual activity of the AAS through its program of the History of the Book in American Culture. The lectureship honors James Russell Wiggins, former editor of the Washington Post, former United States Ambassador to the United Nations, and editor of the Ellsworth, Maine American until his death in 2000. The head of the AAS Council from 1970 to 1977, Wiggins was a longtime student of the history of printing and journalism and an articulate spokesperson for the freedom of the press. The lectureship was endowed with gifts to the Society from his friends and admirers. Wiggins' lectures have featured statements on key methodological and interpretive issues related to book history. Given by scholars in several disciplines from the United States and abroad, and I'm happy to say that I've seen at least one of them here tonight. The lecture was inaugurated in 1983 and has become one of our signature annual events. It's my great honor to introduce tonight's Wiggins lecturer, Georgia Barnhill, a person who in many ways needs no introduction under our generous dome. She served this institution for an impressive 44 years. First as a library assistant, then as curator of graphic arts, and finally as the founding director of the Center for Historic American Visual Culture, Gigi not only made landmark acquisitions that strengthened the Society's graphic arts collections in ways that generations of scholars from now, in ways that generations of scholars from now will be thanking her for, but she also became the collection's greatest champions by speaking on them at countless national and international conferences, publishing on them in several books, journals, and catalogs, developing many grants for the collections to enable their discoverability, and last but not least, tirelessly matching AAS readers with our materials. This last work, the matchmaking on which we here at AAS pride ourselves, inspired Gigi, with the help of John Keenan, who we're also pleased to welcome back to AAS tonight, to convince the National Endowment for the Humanities and AAS President Ellen Dunlop to establish the Center for Historic American Culture. CHAVIC, as it is known, was begun as a complement to, but distinct from, the program in the History of the Book in America. And so you might be asking yourself, why is Gigi giving our annual book history talk? And the answer to this question can only be found in Gigi herself. For it is she who has led the movement in early American studies to bring the pictures back, as her title tonight asserts. She moved the conversation at the intersection of book history, art history, and material culture beyond a crisis or merely tracing influences to one that explores complex contingencies and mutually constituted meaning between the textual and the pictorial. In eager anticipation of a forthcoming book on this very subject, Books for the Genteel, Illustrated American Fiction and Poetry, 1785 to 1885, we welcome Gigi back to AAS to share with us the interdisciplinarity, expertise, and authority she has embodied for decades as a leader in the field of early American studies.
introduction. I'm a little flabbergasted. So good evening, and thank you all for coming. I see so many friends from so many places near and far that I'm absolutely flabbergasted. And it's a great honor to deliver this year's James Russell Wiggins Lecture in the History of the Book in American Culture. I knew Mr. Wiggins, obviously, when I was working here, and it's really an honor to be before you this evening. Like other speakers who've addressed members and friends of the Society and Antiquarian Hall, I am greatly in the debt of all those who have labored to create superb catalog records, and I'm looking at Alan and others here who have enhanced access to the collection electronically, and who have supported the work of the American Antiquarian Society by their many intellectual and financial contributions. AAS is the perfect setting for my presentation tonight because I have obviously relied on its resources for so many years, as will be evident as the time goes on. Several years ago, I wrote an essay on transformations in pictorial printing that appeared in Volume 2 of A History of the Book in America, the multi-volume series published by the Society. In a way, that piece, covering the period from 1790 to 1840, set the stage for this evening's presentation by documenting the beginning of a vibrant printed visual culture. In the past decade, many institutions, including AAS, have digitized thousands of separately published prints, ephemera, and broadsides. AAS, for example, joined forces with Redex to issue broadsides and ephemera from the Society's collection, covering the period from about 1820 to 1880. Digital access to visual materials has enabled historians in many disciplines to incorporate prints and other visual materials in their research and publications. However, access to book and periodical illustrations has lagged, and even when they do appear, seldom does the metadata accompanying the reproductions reveal the publishing context. This evening, using approaches more commonly used by historians of the book than art historians, I will present some of my research on the history of illustration for American fiction and poetry that has been greatly facilitated and enhanced by the efforts of AAS, Redex, and other commercial partners, rendering it possible to bring some of these hidden images into the open. I hope my research eventually will help literary and other scholars look at the pictorial contents of late 18th and 19th century literary publications with a greater understanding and appreciation for the efforts of publishers and illustrators. And we'll just change this opening slide. So it's illustrated Americana on the heap. These are the old issues of the proceedings that were taken out recently. Scholars in different disciplines look at images in books from varying perspectives. Surprisingly, art historians, wedded to the analysis of fine art, sculpture, and architecture, pay less attention to illustrations than one might anticipate. Marcia Reed of the Getty Museum wrote several years ago, and I quote, "The art of book illustration and its overarching relationship to the texts, a nuanced art which is itself a kind of translation, seems to have fallen into the gap between art and literature. Those who study texts tend to ignore the images or think them not important, and vice versa." I can only second Marcia Reed's observations. One of my goals this evening and in my overall project is to put the study of one aspect of visual culture, in my case, book illustration, front and center. AAS has done a great deal already to connect visual culture and history of book studies. Several previous Wiggins lectures, for example, have focused on images. Past lectures have included John Bidwell's American History in Image and Text, and Gregory Noble's, who's here this evening. His 2003 lecture was A Book in the Hand is Worth Two in the Press, Making and Marketing John James Audubon's Birds of America, and Josh Brown's 2009 lecture, Catching His Eye, the Sporting Male Pictorial Press in the Gilded Age. The Center for Historic American Visual Culture, or CHAVIC, and FEBAC, the History of the Book program, also joined forces to sponsor several conferences on topics such as home, school, play, work, the visual and textual worlds of children, Destined for Men, visual materials for male audiences, Before Madison Avenue, Advertising in Early America, and the Visual and the Verbal, Image Text in American Print Culture to 1900. Recipients of the J. and Deborah Last Fellowships often cross disciplines in their studies of visual materials, and the topics of the Chavik Summer Seminars engage both new and established scholars in using the Society's superlative book and print collections in interesting ways that impact their own scholarship as well as their teaching practices. Richard Fox recently observed, steadily the study of visual culture has moved into the mainstream of U.S. historiography. More and more scholars have realized that the pictures they long used to illustrate their books and lectures possess a history of their own as material objects and as ways of seeing. And I think Chavik is part of that narrative that Richard Fox brought into the open. In the years since the program in History of the Book and American Culture began at AAS and the emergence of book studies as a discipline, I have found the concerns of book historians, the study of the creation, publication, distribution, circulation, and reception of text, apply readily to the study of American historical prints and book illustrations. Images tell more than one story. Narrative content, iconography, aesthetics, and cultural context are all valid points of discussion. So is the publishing context that has concerned me and most of my research in the past couple of decades. John Bidwell emphasized the need to understand the process of image production in his essay, American History in Image and Text. He wrote, "Prints and illustrated broadsides operate differently than books. Word for word, they can reveal as much about American culture, but they do require a trained eye ready to look elsewhere than the text, and an abiding regard for technical matters such as design, manufacture, and economics." These three aspects of visual materials, particularly the manufacture of prints, and in particular printmaking processes, certainly have been a stumbling block for historians in general. Working with images requires the acquisition of a new technical language, analogous to acquiring the language of statistical analysis to undertake historical demographic studies. Personally, I think it's a far easier task to handle image-related language, and it remains a priority in the Chavik seminars to introduce this language in a user-friendly way. Helping scholars over this hurdle is essential, and AAS has been instrumental in accomplishing this important task. But how did this curator of graphic arts get so involved in illustrated books in the first place? After all, I oversaw the collection's broadsides, prints, maps, games, photographs, ephemera, and other stuff, sheet music also. What started me on the trail of illustrated books was being the contact person at AAS for H. Dunscombe Colt, who was revising the early 20th century checklist of early American engravings compiled by David Stauffer and Mantle Fielding. Colt had worked extensively in libraries in New York and Washington, D.C., but had never settled into the stacks back here. So I became his amanuensis, compiling information on engraved illustrations found in pre-1820 imprints until he turned the project over to AAS for completion in 1973. Eventually, AAS applied to the National Endowment for the Humanities to bring an additional staff to complete the project that became the online catalog of American engravings. As my colleagues on this project and I moved from an anticipated book publication to an online database, a process supported by the Getty Trust and other foundations, it was feasible and economical to add genre and subject headings to the free text description of each of the 16,800 entries. About 1,000 of the items described were independently published engravings. The rest were book and periodical illustrations, a genre that had received scant scholarly attention because of the difficulty of accessing them. I see my current research project as an effort to bring some of these images into the open. More recently, another NEH-funded project at AAS, Prints in the Parlor, resulted in about 3,600 individual catalog records for illustrations in literary annuals and post-1820 engravings. I thank my lucky stars that AAS was able to do that project and that Christine Graham Ward, who is here tonight, was the single cataloger for the project under Lauren Hughes' supervision, and Lauren's here too. And I just thank them both for such wonderful work. It's fabulous. They did brilliantly. The digital reproductions of the illustrations are incredibly useful, and each image is thoroughly described. What a treasure. As you will see and hear, both projects, the Early American Engravings Project and the Literary Annuals projects, have been immensely useful to me, and I'll focus most of the rest of my remarks on images that can now be easily accessed because of these two projects. These projects serve as models for other initiatives, and one that I would love to see is a simple one. Just catalog all the illustrations in periodicals. And while we're at it, if someone, some organization would go down to Washington and transcribe and make accessible the copyright deposit records for all American prints, that would be okay too. Future possibilities. What does it mean that late 18th century publishers wanted to include illustrations in their literary publications? In my research, I'm particularly focused on images that appeared in works of poetry and fiction for the elite, as opposed to relief cuts that could be made by rank amateurs, including Isaiah Thomas, and printed inexpensively along with texts. By delving into the history of illustration for literature, what can we learn? How are the conditions faced by these artisan engravers? Who designed the images? Who paid for them? How pervasive were literary images in the period from 1785 to 1820? These questions can be addressed by considering images in the same way as book historians analyze texts. Since we're here at AAS and here in Worcester, I'm going to focus on some late 18th century engravings published by Isaiah Thomas and his publisher, his partner, Ebenezer T. Andrews. Then I'll explore with you the recycling of plates used in literary annuals and periodicals in the middle of the 19th century. First, how pervasive were literary illustrations in the late 18th and early 19th centuries? The American Revolution disrupted all manner of trades and occupations in the former colonies. Some skilled engravers left their trades for more lucrative fields, others succumbed to the ravages of old age. Certainly the book trade suffered during the Revolution as patronage shrank and materials such as paper and type were difficult to obtain. And few men or women in this period of chaos expressed themselves in poetry or fiction. And if they did, little was printed with illustrations, if only because there was a dearth of skilled artists. After the close of the Revolution, Americans sought to create their own culture, but the popularity of English fiction and poetry dominated the market, making the sale of American literary production difficult. In the period between 1785 and 1820, the bibliographer Lyle Wright recorded fewer than 25 editions of illustrated American fiction, and Roger Stoddard and David Weitzel identified about 70 volumes of illustrated American poetry in the same period. In contrast, there were 35 illustrated editions of the English poet James Thomson's The Seasons between 1764 and 1820. That was such a popular book, and how did Americans compete? Let's begin, though, just looking first at how prints were made, as John Bidwell suggested. So I'm going to explain the process of line engraving as it was practiced in the late 18th century. This is a 19th century French lithograph, but it's all the same. And this gentleman here is operating the copper plate press. And there's the felt that protects the plate, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. This side is devoted to lithography, which is a whole other subject, and I'm not getting into it tonight. I'll come back tomorrow. Commissioning engravings was complicated. The publisher took the first step by commissioning a design made by an artist or draftsman. Sometimes this individual was identified. Often the design was anonymous, suggesting that the engraver made a copy from an existing illustration, or the quality was such that no one wanted to take responsibility for it. The engraver copied or traced the design onto a very smooth copper plate, a significant manufacturing puzzle in itself. Once the design was transferred, the engraver made grooves into the copper using a sharp tool known as a burin. Alternatively, an etching process was used. The copper plate in that case was covered with varnish, and the printmaker used an etching needle to draw the design, exposing bare metal. The plate was then bathed in acid that created the design on the plate as opposed to manually digging into the copper. When the design was complete, the engraved or etched plate moved to a copper plate printer, as you see here. They used a press very different from that used by a letterpress printer. The printer applied ink to the plate, pressing the ink into the grooves and then removing the excess from the surface of the plate. The plate was placed on the bed of a press, dampened paper was laid over, then protective felt, and the plate was printed. Paper was dried, pressed, and then the printer delivered impressions of the print to the binder. I go into such detail to suggest what an expensive, labor-intensive process this was. Moreover, the number of impressions that could be taken from a copper plate was limited to 1,000 or so, and in some cases even less. Copper, if you've done plumbing, you know it's soft, it's bendable, and the pressure of the copper plate printing press flattened the metal and the image would disappear. Small cuts on wood or metal for almanacs, broadsides, newspaper advertisements, and children's books were much easier to make and to print, since these images were engraved on blocks that could be printed simultaneously with text. Little expertise or training was required. Even different paper was required for engravings than for text, and it was sometimes difficult to obtain, as correspondence between Isaiah Thomas and his partner Ebenezer Andrews attests. Beginning in the mid-1820s, though, steel replaced copper. The more durable metal enabled the creation of finer lines and larger editions. Thousands of impressions could be printed because the steel could be hardened using heat. Publishers lost control of the publication process when they commissioned engraved illustrations. Complaints about having to wait for engraving surfaced frequently in the correspondence between Thomas and Andrews, as well as in periodicals whose editors tried to adhere to a well-defined publishing schedule. Also, some publishers allowed the engravers to hold on to the plates. That's a stupid idea. That caused difficulties for Thomas and Andrews, for example, when they needed additional impressions. So what if the engraver didn't want to make them? You know, they're stuck. Anyway, these situations suggest a fluidity in the printing trade. Hard and fast practices did not exist at the end of the 18th century. Moreover, working conditions were not always the best. And here you have a separately published engraving of Christopher Columbus, and then a detail of the head, which is what we could focus on a little bit. The prolific immigrant engraver David Edwin, born in Bath, England in 1776, arrived in the United States in 1797 after training in England and the Netherlands. War prevented him from returning to England, so he signed on to a ship bound for Philadelphia as a sailor and quickly found work in his trade. His specialty was stipple engraving, an etching process particularly useful in presenting middle-range tones necessary for successful portrait prints. Historian William Dunlap claimed in his History of the Arts of Design of the United States in the mid-1830s, and I quote, "This eminent artist was the first good engraver of the human countenance that appeared in this country." All of his learned skills, however, could not make up for the difficulties found in an emerging trade. Although well-trained and skilled, he had his trials. He wrote to Dunlap that when he first arrived in Philadelphia, he had difficulties in acquiring new tools, and commented copper plates were finished rough from the hammer. No tools to be purchased. He had to depend upon his own ingenuity to fabricate them for himself. And here are the tools that he needed. This flat piece of steel with little projectiles was used to create that middle tone. And then the other tool that Edwin needed is this sort of similar type of object, but on a roller. And these are the kinds of tonal results. And up here is the full tool with that head. And then the top item is, the tip shows you what the profile of a typical burin looked like. So these were tools of his trade. So these specialty tools were, as you can see, very different from the burin more commonly used. He also complained about the, quote, slovenly style of the copperplate printers. Cold weather impeded progress because the workshop of the principal copperplate printer in Philadelphia at the time was open to the winds. Ink, rollers, and paper were difficult to work in the unheated space. Even proper ink was in short supply. The Irish-born illustrator and artist John James Barnhill experimented with substances to make a better black for copperplate printers' ink. The staples of Edwin's trade and skilled copperplate printers, common enough in London, were difficult to find in his adopted work environment. In the face of such difficulties, why did publishers issue illustrations? John Bidwell observed in his essay on Joel Barlow's The Columbiad that in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, even, and I quote, the best efforts of illustrators still called for apology, and American printers were too unsure of their resources, both artistic and financial, to undertake prestige bookmaking. So why would publishers undertake illustrated books for an elite audience? We can again look to the correspondence between Andrews in Boston and Thomas in Worcester for some answers. If it weren't for the fact that two partners lived in two places, by the way, none of this documentation would exist. As already noted, the importation of books from England was part of a robust trade of goods of all types in the colonial period and again in the post-Revolutionary War era. One of these handsomely illustrated imported books inspired Thomas and Andrews in their publishing efforts. Andrews wrote to Thomas that he wished their edition of Charlotte Smith's elegiac sonnets to be, quote, in every respect equal to the 6th London edition. The publishers commissioned Joseph H. Seymour to copy the illustrations designed by the British illustrator Richard Corbould, published in the English edition. It took Thomas and Andrews 4 years to issue their edition that appeared finally in 1795. Seymour, who was born in England in 1769 and settled in 1784 with his family in Portland, where he might have learned to engrave from a silversmith. And he was responsible for engraving this image, and it's actually quite a lovely one if you see it in person. He engraved the images with skill, but in an advertisement for the book, Thomas called on his genteel readers to patronize the book, notwithstanding Seymour's inexperience. He wrote, their favorable acceptance of this and other volumes printed in this country will doubtless raise an emulation to produce others, better executed on superior paper and with more delicate engravings. In other words, Thomas was apologizing for the illustrations in this publication, and he was looking forward to more aesthetically successful images. Elsewhere, Thomas noted, quote, a proper allowance will be made for work engraved by an artist who obtained his knowledge in this country compared with that done by European engravers who have settled in the United States. So here, Thomas is contrasting Seymour's efforts to those of engravers such as John James Barley, John Vallance, or Robert Scott, who all worked in Philadelphia but were trained abroad. As the publication of Smith's elegiac sonnets demonstrated, American designers for illustrations were in short supply. The Catalog of American Engravings contains entries for several hundred illustrations designed abroad but copied by Americans. About the same time that Thomas and Andrews were contemplating the publication of Smith's sonnets, they published Sarah Wentworth Morton's Uwabi, or The Virtues of Nature. For the frontispiece of this tale, drawn from Native American lore, for which no British edition existed, Thomas and Andrews turned to an itinerant Danish portrait and theatrical painter, Christian Gulliver, for the frontispiece. Gulliver's work is well known in Worcester, for he painted several portraits found on the walls of Antiquarian Hall, including Colonel John May, which is back in that corner, and bookseller David West. And his portraits of the Salisbury family are at the Worcester Art Museum. Only a European artist could create such a fanciful costume of the Native American chief. Samuel Hill, an American-born engraver who did an extensive amount of work for Thomas, copied Gulliver's design as a copperplate engraving. The description of Uwabi in the text does include the following attributes. Painted plumes rose from his head. He also wore glistening earrings and bracelets on his manly arms. And there were beaded necklaces on his broad chest. And of course, being an Indian chief, he carried a bow, so it's all there. But if you compare this to this image of King Philip that Paul Revere engraved, there's really quite a difference. And this engraving is adopted from oil paintings of the 4 Indian kings that were made in London in the early 18th century. But that's pretty fanciful, I think. But it's very close to the text. It just doesn't look like a Native American. And this publishing project from the 1790s demonstrates the lack of standard practices for publishers, authors, and engravers with respect to illustrations. In 1792, Thomas and Andrews issued Jeremy Belknap's The Foresters. Correspondence between the partners reveals details about the financial arrangements between the author and publisher. Fortunately, the contract survives at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Writing from Boston, Andrews explained to Thomas, "I have been making a bargain for a copyright of a work with Mr. Belknap. It is a small work, The Foresters or a Burlesque History of America." Andrews supposed that given its size, although that I don't understand, it's 230 pages, but it's a small scale book. Andrews supposed that it would not pose much financial risk. According to the contract dated December 28, 1791, Belknap or his heirs would receive 1/3 of the copies in sheets, that is, unbound, after the cost of the paper was recovered. If the cost of the paper was not recovered by sales, then Belknap would have to pay 1/2 of that cost. But who would pay for the frontispiece? Andrews wrote to Thomas complaining that Belknap would not pay for it. However, Andrews estimated it would only cost $8 to $10 for the engraving and $10 or $12 for the 1,000 copies specified in the contract. And of course, those $10 or $12 are not $10 or $12 of today's currency. It's many times higher. And also, Andrews suggested if the plate were engraved along with another image for a different publication, the cost of printing would be even less because there is some efficiency in printing multiple engravings on a single plate and then you cut them up and distribute them to the proper publication. But this correspondence suggests that the publisher and author were at odds over whose responsibility the costs of illustration to be. From the evidence, it seems the publisher commissioned Joseph H. Seymour to design and engrave the image, although Andrews hoped to incur no costs. The costs, however, for copper plate engraving are not insignificant, given the number of skilled laborers it required. It became traditional, generally anyway, for publishers to assume those costs, but there were undoubtedly exceptions in the decades to come. In any event, in 1791, Belknap was responsible for some publication costs and did not recoup his expenses, leading him to negotiate better terms for himself in the future. Seymour's image is allegorical, unrelated to any specific passage of the humorous text describing the founding and growth of the British colonies. The frontispiece depicts John Bull, an allegorical figure representing Great Britain, signing a deed that gives up the rights of that nation to the American colonies. Behind John Bull stands Columbia. Seymour designed and engraved the frontispiece. Generally, artists did not engrave their own images, but it's possible that being trained as an engraver, he preferred to do his own engraving to control the quality of the reproduction, perhaps reflecting his opinion of the work of Samuel Hill. Thomas and Andrews went on to publish numerous literary illustrations, but mainly for British works in imitation of the style of British publishers such as Robert Bell. A far less elegant publication was the 1794 abridged edition of Pamela. Although anonymously illustrated with 6 copperplate engravings, the book failed to sell well. An advertisement for the book in the Worcester Intelligencer in late 1794 described it as bound in red and lettered, adorned with copper plates. It sold for 3 shillings, 2 pence, so minimal. In 1795, so a year after publication, Matthew Carey in Philadelphia purchased 59 copies of the novel, including several for another bookseller in Philadelphia. In Thomas's account of stock made in August of 1799, 600 copies of Pamela were still on hand, along with 450 copies of Charlotte Smith's sonnets. The Grolier Club has a copy of the latter title, given by Thomas to Harriet Lee in 1807. Clearly, neither copiously illustrated text fared well in the market. However, the Foresters, in contrast, did well enough to merit a second revised and enlarged edition in 1796. Another interest of book historians that I share is the reception of texts or, in my case, images. Circulation of literary productions in the late 18th century and 19th century can be tracked in two ways. The first is that many books for elite readers were published by subscription, and lists of subscribers with their places of residence were sometimes printed at the end of texts. Coupling names with entries in city directories, and the early city directories are, of course, available online these days, reveals trades or professions of the subscribers. For example, there were 400 subscribers for Lydia Bailey's illustrated edition of Philip Freneau's poems. The list of subscribers notes that 400 subscribers ordered almost 1,000 copies of the book, and booksellers accounted for half of that number. And Bailey printed 1,500 copies to have additional copies for her retail trade. Purchasers included James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, 10 copies each, the Library of Congress, the Sheriff of Philadelphia, printers, engravers, physicians, attorneys, and tradesmen, including a jeweler and a cabinet maker. The subscription proposals issued by Young and Etheridge for Thomas Odiorn's Progress of Refinement in November 1792 noted that only 200 subscribers were needed to encourage the publisher to proceed with publication. The absence of newspaper advertisements for this book suggests that the audience was a local one and that few copies were sold on a retail basis. Searching through America's historical newspapers for titles of books often leads to advertisements in towns and cities far from the place of publication. Knowing who bought copies of books and where they lived documents the circulation of the images in these books as well as the related text. 3 major digital projects sponsored by the Antiquarian Society, America's Historical Newspapers, America's Historical Imprints, and the AAS Historical Periodicals Collection greatly facilitate research on the circulation and critical reception of illustration, a use that probably no one anticipated when they were put together. The period from 1820 to 1825 witnessed important changes in image production. The use of copper gave way to steel, enabling engravers to achieve much finer lines and a silvery finish to images. Since steel could be hardened using heat, the plate stood up to the pressure of the engraving press, and thousands of impressions could be issued rather than just hundreds. At the same time, the stereograph process emerged as a way to create printing plates from type, including images, so that larger editions could be printed without damaging the type or relief press. One result of steel engraving, as I've noted, was the ability of steel plates to withstand the pressure of the press. The amount of manual labor did not change, however, so printing remained slow and labor-intensive. The process was used extensively to produce illustrated literary annuals, beginning with the Atlantic Souvenir, published in Philadelphia by Henry C. Carey and Isaac Lee in December 1825. Indeed, Henry Carey went to England in order to discuss possible illustrations with his brother-in-law, an expatriate, Charles Robert Leslie, residing in England, who provided 2 of the 7 engravings in the first of a long series, including this engraving, Rebecca. Overall, Leslie provided designs for 13 engravings for literary annuals in the space of just a decade. The circulation of literary annual illustrations and their relationships to associated texts has long interested me, and 2 projects, Prints for the Parlor, which I described earlier, and then research by Cynthia Patterson, a fellow at AAS in 2009, have enabled me to delve quite deeply into the reuse of engraved plates in the middle decades of the 19th century. Patterson recorded engravings in every illustrated periodical she could find to create a working database for her book, Art for the Middle Classes, America's Illustrated Magazines of the 1840s. And she was kind enough to share her compilation with me. It turns out that the steel plates became a commodity that sold at many of the important book trade sales that took place beginning in the 1820s. Costs and publishing schedules are among the reasons that images circulated between annuals and periodicals. Tracking the circulation of specific plates from one genre to another is an excellent case study in the relationship of image and text, certainly a concern to both art and literary historians. While working on the catalog of American engravings back in the 70s, I noticed in the Stauffer Fielding volumes inscriptions on a number of early 19th century engravings that read, "Published for Atkinson's Casket." The first edition or state of those prints appeared prior to 1820. I had no idea what the allusion to the casket meant, but I deduced at the time that the second states appeared after 1820, so my colleagues and I could safely ignore them. You've got to cut somewhere. My current research on illustrations for literary publications brought me back to the casket, and I made a census of the illustrations and sought to determine their sources, since so many looked like they were indeed issued prior to 1821. This project turned out to be really quite a bit of fun, thanks to the Catalog of American Engravings and to Christine Graham Ward's cataloging the literary annual illustrations so carefully. The Casket was, at its time, the longest surviving American literary magazine. Published in Philadelphia by Samuel Atkinson beginning in June 1824, it continued until George R. Graham acquired it and William Burton's Gentleman's Magazine in 1840 to create Graham's Magazine, which is really a quite well-known periodical. Portraits were the featured genre of images in the first years of publication of the Casket, and I learned that several of them had first appeared in the second decade of the 19th century in the Philadelphia magazine, The Portfolio, and in Delaplane's Repository, a biographical dictionary of famous Americans published between 1816 and 1819. Literary subjects of particular interest to me didn't appear in the Casket until 1832. That year, Atkinson apparently acquired the engraved steel plates commissioned the previous year by Carey and Lee for the Atlantic Souvenir, published in Philadelphia, and in the Keepsake Américain, published in New York. This was a French language annual. The total cost of the engravings to Carey and Lee was over $4,000 for the illustrations, or a third of the total cost of the Atlantic Souvenir for that year. And the publishers were undoubtedly delighted to recoup some of their expenses by selling the plates to another publisher. But what happens when the plates are detached from their original contexts? In the early years of the Atlantic Souvenir, illustrations generally corresponding closely to the text or vice versa. However, by 1831, the close relationship between text and image began to erode. Perhaps Carey and Lee were simply cutting costs when they included in the Atlantic Souvenir for 1831 an illustration by the British artist William F. Witherington, reproduced by the Philadelphia engraver Francis Carney, called The Beggar's Petition. This is a title of a celebrated poem by Oliver Goldsmith, and the publisher of one of Goldsmith's collections of poems probably commissioned this illustration. In the Atlantic Souvenir, this image accompanies an American story with the title The Aged Mendicant by Charles West Thompson, a frequent contributor to the Atlantic Souvenir. His story is set in Pennsylvania and ends with an elderly man encountering his daughter and her family, from whom he had been estranged for many years. The number of children in the illustration corresponds with the number in the text, but the construction of the cottage, particularly the leaded windows, looks distinctly European. When Atkinson acquired the plate for inclusion in the casket, he had the title changed to The Aged Mendicant, so it would correspond to the title of Thompson's story. Are you confused yet? Hold on. The image reappears in The Gift of Friendship for 1849 with that title, but with a new poem, The Aged Mendicant, by James Knapp, an American deaf and dumb poet. As you can understand, the relationship between image and text shifts as the needs of the publishers change. Another illustration with a questionable relationship to its text is the British artist William Collins' The Fisherman's Return, showing three children playing at the edge of the sea. The poem of the same title in the Atlantic Souvenir concludes, "But our toils and dangers over, then the faggots brightly burn, soon the festive board they cover, and to welcome our return." The poem and image do not really correspond at all. This engraving appeared in the Atlantic Souvenir for 1831 and the casket in June 1833, with a poem by the American writer Richard Penn Smith. However, in the Keepsake Américain, the illustration appeared with a French poem, La Pêche. The image showing children examining a net by the shore is more suited to a text about fishing, not a homecoming. In the Hyacinth for 1849 and the Gift of Friendship for 1850, the engraving reappears, but with poems by two other writers. Likewise, other illustrations in the Atlantic Souvenir for 1831, The Minstrel, The Shipwrecked Family, and Los Musicos after Watteau, do not relate to their accompanying texts. The figures in the cost book for the Atlantic Souvenir for 1831 includes just $500 for artists, suggesting that it was cheaper to recycle British work than to commission new drawings from American artists. However, Americans were still responsible for the engravings, even if they reproduced European images. Tracing other sources for engravings in later issues of the casket would occupy hours of our time. They include the Atlantic Souvenir for 1830, Youth's Keepsake for 1831, the Token for 1832, 36, and 37, the Gift and the Magnolia for 1835, and the Oriental Annual published in London by Bull and Churton in 1835. This final title features 22 illustrations engraved after original drawings by the British artist William Daniel, known for his artistic explorations of India. Daniel had reproduced his own views of India as aquatints in the early 19th century. After his death, London publishers published a series of annual volumes reproducing his prints as steel engravings with a history of India written by the Reverend Hobart Conter. I think from this discussion thus far that it's evident that a thorough catalog of illustrations and periodicals would be a great addition to the tools of visual culture specialists. We can look at one image, the Indian fruit seller, that traveled from the London 1835 Oriental Annual to America. That's the London edition. There's the American edition. Barely visible in the reproduction on the left at the top is the title of the book. Below the image is the attribution of the designs to Daniel. The illustration appeared next in the Parlor scrapbook, edited by Willis Gaylord Clark, and published in Philadelphia by Carey, Lee, and Blanchard in 1836. Also in that volume was the Rajputni Bride. Both engravings were accompanied by poems by a lady, no more text on India. Other images from the 1835 annual appeared in the United States in the Parlor scrapbook for 1837. Then in December 1839, the Indian fruit seller resurfaced in Atkinson's casket, accompanied by a story by an American in the East. Other engravings from the British Oriental Annuals appeared even later in the Oriental Annual, edited by James P. Walker and published in New York in 1857. One reason that Atkinson reused available engraved plates was his need for illustrations to be ready for publication in a timely manner. The editor of the New York Mirror apologized in January 1834 for the delay in providing engravings for his issues. And I quote, "What little delay has occurred rests not with us, but with the artists engaged in preparing the plates. Writers could more quickly supply a poem or short narrative for the editor than an engraver and printer could supply impressions of an original drawing. The publisher of the Mirror did not recycle plates from other publications and incurred, therefore, substantial costs in commissioning them. When the New York Mirror ceased publication at the end of 1842, the editor blamed the cost of engravings on the collapse of the periodical." We will close by looking briefly at the movement of illustrations in the reverse direction, from a periodical to literary annuals. Caroline Kirkland edited the Union magazine from May 1847 through 1848 and commissioned handsome mezzotint engravings from paintings by Tompkins H. Madison, acclaimed at the time as a constant and popular contributor to the exhibitions, especially of American figure and genre subjects, a department to which at the time but few of our artists turned their attention. He was a prolific designer of book illustrations, and many of his more important pictures were engraved and widely circulated. In the first year of the magazine, Kirkland commissioned about 20 illustrations from this artist. Of these engravings, at least 3/4 appeared in later annuals. It's interesting to note that the plates passed on to a number of different publishers. 3 of the engravings appeared in the Christian Parlor book in 1849. 2, the guide in Putnam's duel with the British officer, appeared in both the Gem of the Season for 1850 and the Thought Blossom in 1854. Putnam's duel was also issued in the Ladies' Souvenir for 1854 and in the Winter Wreath in 1856. One of his best-known paintings is The Novel Reader, which was exhibited at the National Academy of Design in New York in 1841. Kirkland reproduced it in the Union magazine in November 1847. The illustration appears to be a satire, but Kirkland writes that, quote, "We consider a thoughtless and absorbing habit of novel reading next to a love of the bottle in its ruinous effect upon character and happiness. Yet it would be contrary to all experience to think violence would mend the matter." So there's one take on this image. In the 4 annuals that use the image from 1849 to 56, it appears with the story The Novel Reader by N.P. Willis, who added his own layers of meaning to what was once an independent work of art. So what do we learn from this excursion into the publication of engraved plates? Examining engravings from the late 18th century suggests some of the conditions in the book trade that made publishing for an elite market difficult. Skilled designers in engravings were at a premium, equipment was sometimes difficult to find, and few critical comments about illustrated texts in newspapers and magazines exist, suggesting that editors didn't know how to write about them, and I think that's an actual problem. In the genre of periodicals and literary annuals, the relationship of text and image needs to be carefully assessed for each image because of the use and reuse of the engraved plates. A cataloging project analogous to Prints in the Parlor, but for periodical illustrations, would really help us unlock the relationships in the 2 genres of print. And another topic seldom considered is the use of an independent work of art in a published context. And does linking American texts, whether poetry or prose, to European works of art complicate contextual considerations? Probably. I'm looking at Meredith out there and hoping that these are some questions for literary and art historians to ponder. I could talk more about this for hours, but I kind of hear Mark McCorrison up there in the dome, and it is he who started me on this book project. But I can hear Mark say, enough is enough, so thank you.